Good, thank you, thank you. Okay, so in this talk, I will present the results from our most recent study of OV2 31.8 based on ALMA observations with high angular resolution. We report on the discovery of a rotating disk at the core of this object. And this is important because rotating structures are invoked by most planetary nebula shaping theories, but direct empirical confirmation and characterization is very difficult. So indeed, this is the first confirmed detection of a rotating disk in a pre-planetary nebulae with massive bipolar outflows. So OV2 31.8 is a well-known bipolar nebula around an AGB star named QX. So this star, QX poop, is a Mira-type variable that, well, as you can see, it has prematurely developed a post-EGB-like nebula with a spectacular bipolar morphology and also very fast outflows with velocities of up to for a few hundred kilometers per second. So QX poop is part of a binary system with at least one companion, which is a main sequence star, and that probably has something to do with the early evolution of this object. So the study I'm presenting today is a follow-up of a previous work, also based on ALMA observations, that was aimed at characterizing in detail the whole nebulae at different spatial scales. From these observations, we found that the molecular outflow has a structure much more complex than we previously thought. We discovered an intricate array of substructures, actually. Some of them are nested, and some of them have slightly different orientations. And all this suggests a complex formation history. So the nebula complexity can be seen, can be guessed already from this data, in particular from the position velocity diagram along the axis where some of the major features that we discover are indicated. But let's focus on the central parts of the nebula. Here we discovered two main features, right? One is a compact parcel of gas and dust that surrounds the mass-losing AGB star. This region that we call clamp S is selectively traced, as you can see, by certain species, including sodium chloride. There is also a compact bipolar outflow that emanates from clamp S that is selectively traced by SI. And let me notice a few differences with respect to the large-scale bipolar outflow of this object. This one is relatively symmetric, as you can see, with respect to the equatorial plane. It is slow, and it is also younger than the large-scale nebula, which is about 800 years old. So with the goal of dissecting the central regions of OV2 31.8 and with the hope of finding clues to understanding nebula shaping in this object, we observed again this target with ALMA, but with a factor of 10 higher angular resolution. And we map the continuum, and we map also molecular lines, of course also selecting species that we knew were good tracers of the new components that we had discovered previously at the center of the reactor. So the continuum emission in OH 31.8 is due to dust thermal emission. So clamp S is now spatially resolved, and we find two main components. One is an extended disk-like component, elongated in the direction perpendicular to the bipolar nebula. Then there is also an unresolved point-like component, which is marked here by the star. So in this figure, now we show the map of the continuum after subtraction of the point-like component. So here we can see the dimensions of the extended disk. This is consistent with a circular disk of radius of about 40 AUs that is inclined about 40 degrees or less with the line of sight. The value of the inclination is actually in very good agreement with the inclination of the lobes with respect to the plane of the sky, which is determined from previous works. And this implies that the disk and the lobes are actually perpendicular orthogonal. The point-like continuum emission is partially due to the photosphere of the AGB star, but there is also a hot dust component around it in the vicinity of the central star, within a few stellar radii. So now we observed a small offset between the position of the central star and the center of the dust disk. So assuming that the disk is circumbinary, and adopting reasonable values for the masses of QX up and the companion, then we derive from this offset the orbital separation of the system, which we found to be about 20 AUs or so. But let's have a look now at the central regions of the nebula as traced by sodium chloride. So we have detected a total of 8 different transitions from sodium chloride. The lines are weak, but they all consistently show a very similar brightness distribution. You can see here the velocity curves. So taking advantage of these, the lines have been combined to increase the signal to noise ratio. And as you can see here, particularly in the integrated intensity maps, the sodium chloride emission arises from a compact region that is surrounding the dust disk, which is indicated here by the dashed ellipse. So this is consistent with the sodium chloride emission arising from the surface layers of the above and below the dust disk. Okay. Now these layers of the disk are in rotation. Note the clear velocity gradient in this velocity map with the rest shifted emission displaced to the west of the nebula. So this gradient along the equator is indicative, clear indication of rotation. The rotation is also, of course, apparent in these position velocity cuts along the equatorial direction at different offsets that you can see in panels A, B, and C. So here, the east to west velocity gradient, marked by the arrows, indicates rotation's velocities of about 4 kilometers per second in these regions. In addition to rotation, we also find expansion in the disk. See, for example, this position velocity cut along the axis, where you can see this gradient, indicative of expansion, but the velocity, the expansion velocity is very low, of about 3 kilometers per second or so. It's really low. So we have modeled the sodium chloride emission to constrain the geometry and the kinematics of the rotating disk, and this is the schematic representation of the geometry adopted in our model that, as you can see here, reproduces reasonably well the and here's a summary of the parameters of our best fit model. Note, for example, the high densities derived that result in a total mass of the disk surface layers of about 210 to the minus 3 solar masses. Of course, the angular resolution is still insufficient to study in detail the radial variations of any of the model parameters across the disk. In particular, we cannot infer whether the rotation follows a Keplerian or a sub-Keplerian velocity law. So the presence of expansion in the disk probably suggests sub-Keplerian rotation, which would then imply a lower limit for the central dynamic mass of about 0.7 solar. So we detect emission also from potassium chloride, which is another salt, and water. And both species have co-spatial emission with sodium chloride, that is, they also arise in the rotating disk. Now let's focus on the compact bipolar outflow that is emanating from clamp S. In addition to SIO, the outflow is also traced by SIS. The SIS maps that you can see here show clearly that the lobes have a conical geometry at the base, consistent with the wide angle wing, okay? And in any case, very moderate expansion velocities, never higher than 20 kilometers per second. So to better characterize the velocity field and geometry of the outflow, a position velocity cut along the axis is quite useful, as you can see here. And well, we find that the observations are in principle consistent with the radial velocity field and with a gradual upward acceleration of the gas along the poles up to a terminal expansion of about 17 kilometers per second or so that is reached at about 250 meters. After these distances, the velocity remains more or less constant. So given the conical geometry of the wind at the base, we can constrain the inclination to values of about 30 to 35, so similar to the large-scale nebula, and its age also to about 100 years. So the innermost layers of the SIO outflow, closer to the center, are best traced by vibrationally excited SIO transitions that you can see here. So in these maps, you can see that the SIO emission from these levels, from these high excitation levels, has a very comparable size to the sodium chloride and is actually kind of running inside the structure traced by sodium chloride. The kinematics of this outflow at the base is also expansive, but rotation is also present, particularly in regions closer to the equator, as you can see here in this velocity map. Look at this reshifted versus blue shifted emission. And actually, the presence of rotation is somewhat expected, given that the SiO and the sodium chloride emission kind of overlap at the base of the outflow. So they probably have the same kinematics as well. So some results. So, well, in OH 31.8, we observe sodium chloride on the surface of the dust disk that is beyond the region of massive dust formation. Okay? In normal AGB stars, this is not expected because in these regions, salt should be incorporated almost fully into dust grains and therefore significantly depleted. That's gas depleted. Okay? So at the base of the lobes, we observe sodium chloride to be co-spatial with SiO and SIS, which are well-known shock traces. So we believe that probably shocks are somehow also extracting sodium chloride from the grace and returning to the gas.
1 minute.
Okay, thank you. So now we measured very low expansion velocities, as I said before, of 3 kilometers per second, but in regions relatively large, at relatively large distances from the central source, in regions where the wind of or the wind velocity of a normal oxygen-rich star like Aiki Tau, for example, should be close to the terminal velocity already, as you can see here. And the terminal velocity for a high mass loss rate object as QX should be 15 to 20. So the observed velocity is low, way below the expected velocity in these regions. So we don't really understand the reason for this inefficient wind acceleration, but as I'll show you in the next slide, this is actually the key, or one of the key factors to form a dense circumbinary structure like the one we have observed. Right? So in addition to extremely low velocity, OV231 brings together other favorable conditions for the formations of a dense equatorial structure as a result of, for example, of windrow's low overflow mass transfer. These factors are a very massive companion, which is of about 2 solar mass star, and then also comparable sizes for the dust condensation radius and the rose law radius. So as shown, for example, in the recent work by Nebula et al., these three are exactly key parameters for effective mass transfer to the companion and the eventual compression of the UV wind on the orbit. So finally, to finish, sorry, the compact SiO outflow that we discovered does not have very extreme properties actually in terms of velocity, for example. So maybe it could be just the result of confinement of the going AGB wind by the dense storms, okay? Or maybe it's the shadings in other ways, but in principle, that could work. We know that now at present there are no signs of fast ejections in OH 31.8. So accretion on a compact object is not needed now to explain the launching of the SiO outflow that we observe. And indeed, it seems that accretion is not happening at present. However, that wasn't the case 800 years ago, of course, when the fast lobes of the large-scale nebula were shaped or accelerated. So something has changed, and we've discussed this before. I think this point has come across the meeting already. Something is changing. Maybe in this case, maybe we don't know. Maybe the accretion disk around the companion has been destroyed in recent times for some reason. Maybe accretion is just episodic. Maybe it's now OH31 is now in a low accretion rate or a quiescent state, in which the disk around the companion is steadily building up its mass, but there is no effective disk-to-companion accretion and no jet launch. Okay? So, of course, the large-scale nebula could be the product of a binary interaction mode completely different from windrow's low overflow. For example, I don't think we can rule out that it was the result of a post-common evolution involving a third companion. That we don't know. So, yeah, evolution is also complex in these subjects, I think. So I'll leave here my conclusions, and I'll thank you all very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Carmen. We have time for just one question. Bruce, I see your hand.
What a wonderful talk, Carmen. Every time you give a talk on OH231, I learn so much. You and your group are to be congratulated for stalking this thing and trying to make sense out of it. It is a really difficult object to understand. And I think that it's driving a wedge between the observers who seem to, like you, seem to expose the complexity of bipolars and theoreticians who try to make everything as simple as possible. My question refers to slide 17, and I wonder if you could show it to us and play. There's a binary star in this system. I wonder if you could place both of the components of the binary system onto the figure.
Which figure? I mean,
slide 17.
Okay, let me share the screen again. Slide 17. Yes, actually, well, the two stars. I mean, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a little star, a pink star here. You see it where I'm pointing it to with my arrow. So the separation. So the other should be kind of here, something like that.
And the astrometry errors are small, I presume?
Yes, I mean, let me go back to the continuum. Maybe there you can see it better. Because it is, the field of view is larger. So you see, this is the position of the, well, the position of the point-like source that where I mean, that is tracing the mass-losing star, where the hot dust component is also there. And this is about 17 AUs, okay? If you take into account the inclination of this 17 AUs. So the other one is kind of like this. The companion will be kind of like here.
Thank you.
If this is correct, yeah, I think the relative position is relatively well determined to an accuracy of maybe a few AUs, but not too much larger than that.
I saw Joel's hand also raised. Do you want to ask a question or a comment?
I can wait till the discussion, Jesus, if we need to move along. I just wanted to point out that I did point out in the Slack that the hot dust component, Carmen, you found is consistent with early polarimetric studies of this object, where the scattered light looked especially red. So that's fascinating. Everything you presented is fascinating, but that caught my eye.
Do we have some more questions? Raghavendra? Go ahead, Raghavendra.
Sorry, I was muted. Carmen, the hot disk component is unresolved. Is that correct?
Yes, it's unresolved. Yeah.
And you estimate a temperature about 1400 Kelvin for that?
Yes, I mean that's actually the peak mine brightness of the data, and yeah, it can't be much smaller than this because then the temperature will go up, and this is already very close to the maximum dust condensation temperatures that we have.
Have you considered the possibility that it's a radio photosphere as has been proposed for many other AGB stars by Reed and Menton quite a while ago?
Yes, not yet, but yeah, we have that in mind. I mean, we're still working on this data, right? So okay. So far, I think this is the most likely possibility, but we are also thinking about that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you, Carmen. If you have any more questions, please go to the SDN channel and put them there, write them there, and we can use them